Okay. Well, I assume I'm speaking now to a great Society of Illustrators online audience. Welcome to a conversation on Invisible Men, the Trailblazing Black Artists of Comic Books, written by Ken Quattro, who is one of our panelists tonight. In addition, we're also going to have on the panel Stanford W. Carpenter, a scholar, cultural anthropologist, artist, chairman of the board of directors of the Institute of Comic Studies. Ken himself is a comics historian and an author of hundreds of articles and books, as well as being a historical consultant on the 2017 Hollywood film Professor Marston and the Wonder Woman. And in addition, of course, we have Craig Yoe, the inimitable, the often indescribable, but the always indispensable founder and publisher of Yoe Books. He is an art director, editor, author, cartoonist, historian, just he's just always in your face. Anyway, it's a great
You could have left that last part off.
Anyway, it's a great panel. By the way, my name is Calvin Reid. I'm the senior news editor of Publishers Weekly. I'm also the editor of PW Comics World, which is our online, PW's online coverage of comics and graphic novels. I'm also a co-host on More to Come, which is PW's weekly podcast on comics and graphic novel publishing. Check us out online at publishersweekly.com/comics. So Invisible Men, the title of the book kind of says it all. We're looking at newly discovered this work by groundbreaking, or as the title of the book says, trailblazing Black authors who will pave the way for us today in an industry at a time of Jim Crow apartheid in the comic book industry. Some of the men, maybe a handful, maybe known to you. Certainly someone like Matt Baker over the last few years we've learned a lot more about his work and his impact. But for me, for instance, many of these, this was a truly an education, an introduction to their work. And we're going to spend the next hour just talking about the world of these early pioneering comic book authors, and I think we're going to have a great time doing it. All right, but first, Lindsay, why don't you play? We've got a short book trailer video about Invisible Men.
The night bird calls and shadows creep into my mind, into my sleep. I do not know if I shall rise or open up these weary eyes.
All right, well, that's a great introduction, and maybe we'll talk a little bit about how that.
I saw your face in there. You're in your face, our faces all the time.
Okay, there you go. This is what we're going to be dealing with all the time. There's a little extra entertainment value for this panel, the panel that we're conducting tonight. But first, before we start talking with Ken, and while I hold off Craig, I'd love this to talk. I'm going to jump first to Stanford Carpenter, who, if I neglected to mention, he wrote the introduction to the book. So Stanford, actually, would you give us a little bit more information about your background?
Well, I'm a cultural anthropologist. A lot of my research looks into comics. I especially love interviewing and talking to comic creators about how they go about creating images of identity in comics. I came to this at one point even having my own comic strip retelling African folktales And that just alerted me to the fact that when you make a comic, it's very much a group process. You've got publishers saying we want this. So when I got drafted into cultural anthropology, my first thought was to skip focus. Much of the focus at the time was on, well, how many images of Black people do we have, et cetera. And instead to focus on the people making the images, to figure out, well, if we agree that these images are problematic, how come the system reproduces them?
Well, one of the things your introduction does, the book does it as well. You refer to the very famous insight by the great Black sociologist W.E.B. Du Bois, who talk about the double consciousness that Black people live through, that both American and Negro. And then, of course, the book title itself, Invisible Men, it refers to, obviously, references back to, Ralph Ellison's great novel, where the protagonist, says, I'm invisible because you refuse to see me. Can you talk a little bit about how these themes echo throughout the book?
Well, yeah. I mean, one of the things that's really interesting is that much of this book is before the Civil Rights Movement, where we have a different construction of identity, right? Like, there are a lot of groups right now that we would consider to be white that back then would not be considered to be white. I mean, the example I like to bring up is that the signs around employment, there were signs that said Jews, dogs, and Irishmen need not apply, right? So we have to put ourselves into that mindset when we look back at this period of time. Comics themselves, a lot of the people who are involved in comic books are people who are from, some of the out groups amongst white society, right? They can't, at the time, it's if you want to have status, you're doing comic strips, and then all of a sudden, people who couldn't get into that went into comic books. What's really interesting about what happens with Black people in that configuration is that there was a Black press. So there was a place where you could have the status of creating creating comic strips if you were, for the Black community, and there'd be a status within the Black community on one side of the color line, right? And what Ken does an amazing job of showing is that the color line was permeable. You see, we think of the color line as being like solid. It's not solid. What it is people go on the other side of the color line for all sorts of cultural and economic activities, right? And in this case, it's like, crossing the color line, working for these small comic shops that Ken will I'm sure go into more. And
when you say comic shop, I think you should explain that a little bit.
Oh,
a modern audience
then,
might be
a
confused.
comic shop refers to a studio of people who would create a comic for a publisher. So the publisher didn't necessarily even know anything about who was creating the books.
Like a packager.
Exactly. And
so it wasn't just a friendly group of artists; it was a business. And
exactly.
Often helmed by someone who wasn't necessarily creative or artistic or literary wise. It was a business.
Exactly. And what's interesting about that configuration is, even if a publisher didn't like the idea of a Black person working on their book, they wouldn't know. So a Black person could go and they could meet up with someone who's running one of these shops and can work on a book, and it wouldn't be known that they're working on the book. And that's what made things so difficult for Ken, right? Because these people are literally made invisible by the production process. And in many cases, what they're doing is in some cases they're making their money to pay the rent, and they're making their money to also help them support other activities for which they do more publicly within the Black press or in other fine art settings.
Okay. Stanford, I'm going to jump in here, but I'm going to come back with some other questions for you. I want to jump over to Ken now. So Ken, maybe you can give us a little more information about your background and why you were drawn to do this, drawn to work on this material.
Okay, well, I've just been a comic fan and collector and that forever. But for about 50 years, I've been what they call a historian. I like to think of myself as a detective, but all I do is I research and I write about, the creators basically involved in the making of comic books. And about 20 years back, one of the people I wanted to write about was Matt Baker. And at that time, there wasn't much known about Baker other than the fact that a lot of people knew that he was Black. And a lot of people considered him the only Black comic book artist of the 1940s and 50s, which was a very strange sort of thing to, at least in my mind, to assume that there was only one Black person working in comics. So anyway, after a couple of years of asking around and trying to find stuff about Baker, somebody tuned me into Samuel Joyner, who was a retired Black cartoonist living in Philadelphia. He worked for the Philadelphia Tribune for years and years. Well, I got Mr. Joyner's address, wrote to him, and he wrote me back this beautiful 4-page letter talking about not only meeting Matt Baker, but Ted Shearer and E. Sims Campbell and other people he'd met back in his early days. And from that letter, we communicated a couple of different times back and forth. He also gave me some photocopies and clippings of newspaper articles that he had. And he started me on this journey because it opened up my eyes that there was more to, the Black contribution to comic books than just Matt Baker. And starting from that point on, I started trying to find, who else was there, involved. But the problem was, Calvin, is that my usual sources that I used, which were white media, white newspapers, magazine stuff, didn't carry any information about any of these men. So I changed my tactic and I started using Black media. And I started reading Black newspapers, Black magazines, Black books, anything I could find. And I had to build my own database of all this information because unfortunately, most libraries and that never saved Black newspapers. And so it took me years and years. It took me 15 years to do this, to start finding all these little crumbs of information, these threads, about these men where one would refer to another and one article would mention somebody and stuff. And I finally built this history, I finally put together what this history of exactly these men were, the world that they were, working in. And I used that as an entry point into their lives. And I expanded from there. I looked at their lives, not only in comic books, but what led up to them, working in comic books and what they did, afterward as well. In all of them, without exclusion, had a much wider range of experience than just the comic books. The comic books were actually probably the least of what they did, and I went back, I did a lot of genealogical research for each one of them. I go back generations, to try to show people the world that they grew up in and how it affected the work that they put out.
Well, let me ask you this, and this might be where we bring Craig in. But okay, you've done this groundbreaking research. Did you understand how you're going to publish this? Did you have a path to publication?
No, I didn't. See,
okay.
No, it's true. I mean, one of the problems, Cal, with the type of work that I do, the type of research I do, is knowing whether or not it's even marketable. I mean, I'm not writing about Superman and Batman and how great they are, and just talking about the popular guys, the cool kids and stuff like that. I'm writing about a lot of these fringe ideas that people don't really get. And to me, comic book history is just a part of a wider history. It's part of American history. It's part of world history. And that's what I try to do in my writing. Well, very few people get that in a lot of times in the world of comic fandom. It's kind of a niche idea. I mean, Roy Thomas has published a lot of my articles. And, there's been different magazines and stuff. Well, Craig, I've known for a long time now, and he's been farsighted enough to publish my stuff in the past and add some articles. And we've helped each other on different projects over the years. And a few years back, he asked me, he says, "Hey, you got a book that you want to write?" And I said, "Yeah, I do." And it was about these Black men, because I've always felt, I said, nobody knows this stuff. I said, I'd written some articles about E.C. Stoner and things like that had been published, but nobody knows the wide range, the wealth of material that's out there and the information about these men. And like I said, I give Craig all the credit in the world, for, he just opened the door for me, says, "Go ahead and do it. Let's see what happens."
Well, don't give him too much credit. He'll get a big
I know.
So we're gonna bring Craig into this discussion now. So why don't you give us some insight into the publishing process? Now, look, for those who don't know, I kid because I care. Craig Yoe is a phenomenal archivist and publisher, and he has, in some ways, he's a hero of bringing the past years of this great industry, bringing it forward for a new generation. So, Craig,
Wow.
how'd you want? Yeah, there you go. Right.
I'm
Tell us
impressed.
a
I'm
little
not easily
more about-
impressed.
Tell us about the publishing side. All right. How did you figure out, okay, how am I going to not lose money on this really worthy project?
I haven't figured that out yet, Calvin.
Okay. All right. We'll worry about that later.
Throw me an easier question.
Yeah.
Well, it is true that publishing books about comics history, and we've along with my partner, Felicia Gusoni, who is modest, so she's not the visible blowhard that I am. We've published going on 100 books on comics history, and it is can use the word niche. It's a niche interest and market, and it's sort of small press. I started over 50 years ago publishing fanzine as a teenager in my parents' basement. I did a comics fanzine, and instead of a fanzine about the contemporary Marvel heroes of the time in the mid 60s, my first article was about cowboy comic books of the 1950s. I've always been interested in what wasn't popular or gonna get a lot of praise or recognition. So I think Ken and I, one of the reasons we're brothers from the same mother is that we both like whatever everybody else likes. We want to explore the other stuff. Right. So, but knowing Ken and like you said, having worked in some projects with him and seeing his passion and some shared passions and interest, and seeing the quality of his writing and some contributions he made to some of my books. I did ask, they say everybody has a book in them. And I thought, well, I bet Ken has a book in them. He's done all these hundreds of articles, but I bet he has a book. And to hear about this, I instantly thought, this book is important. This book is fascinating. This book reveals things that have never been revealed before. That have been invisible, as the title goes. So I was excited about it. I didn't know about the potential. We're getting a fantastic response, but I think at that time it's interesting, even what's been going on in the world the last few years, because while there's been many people living the life and being interested in the field, I don't know that the world has been paying enough attention and think to things that are explored in this book, and they haven't been saying Black Lives Matter. And so even a couple of years ago, when we teamed up to do this book with Ken, that wasn't a phrase on anybody's minds. It hadn't been coined yet. But so in some ways, we're fortunate that it's come out now when people are anxious, and it will have a larger audience than it would have been if we would have brought it out a year or 2 years ago. So
let me ask you something. What are there special challenges to putting together a book like this? Reproducing the art. Finding original art. I mean, what goes into that aspect of rescuing, material that, probably wasn't produced in a way that was archival?
Well, Ken brought not only his written research and genealogies and stuff like that. He's been collecting comic books and imagery and photographs, and so even when we agreed together to do the book, he hadn't sent me the wealth of beautiful imagery that he had been putting together, and that's one of the things that really excited me, because even when I was doing fanzines 50 years ago, and then later on, became an art director and graphic designer and book designer and stuff, my influence wasn't so much art school, because I dropped out, but it was comic books. So I really like my graphic design has been informed by comic books, in that I try to integrate words and pictures. But with Ken's collection, we had this beautiful imagery and historic imagery and moving imagery, and it seemed like a beautiful documentary film, and if comics is film on paper, this book is a film on paper, and maybe it'll go from paper to a film someday, I hope. So we had a rich tableau to work from. But again, we tried to, I learned a long time ago, when I backed into publishing, that for introduction and text, one of the things people do is, sadly, a lot of people don't even read the text, but they follow the pictures and the captions of the pictures, which does, dovetail into comics. So we tried to, as we laid out the book, Cleetsia and I, we tried to tell the picture with the story with the pictures and the captions, and then they're so compelling, then that sometimes leads the opposite of what you would assume. That sometimes leads to people really digging in and reading Ken's brilliant text. So yeah, even the cover, we tried to tell a story, because you can see that the heroes and the beautiful women and the Dick Tracy type detective and the zombie are in front, and the black men who created them and drew their adventures are in the back. They're invisible, so we even tried to tell the story in that sense. And then you open up to the title page, and all of a sudden you see, like, the characters are gone, and now you're gonna be, as you read Ken's brilliant research, you're gonna find out about the men behind the characters. So.
The foregrounding that we've all been waiting for. Okay,
Yeah.
Junior, hold on right there. I want to jump back to Stanford. I want to throw another supposedly big idea to that. I mean, one of the things that Ken talks about, and I'm curious about, is the identities, and you were talking about that, the identities of the men that we were talking about, how they were shaped. And I thought it was interesting. He talked about, all of these men are sort of starting their careers around World War II, but they were kind of shaped by the years from about Reconstruction up until the. So I'm wondering, you touch on this a little bit in the introduction. Maybe you can elaborate on that a little bit more.
Well, it is an interesting time, right? We've got people coming together in cities. We've got people coming. You've really got a lot of community building at that time. I think what's really interesting is that going into that period, you also have you have like a sharpening. You actually, we come back to this notion of the color line, right? Where like you really have strong communities forming. You've got other things in the background, like the Harlem Renaissance. So you've got some real thriving separate cultures, right? And it's all stuff that we think of as separate. And it is important to acknowledge the separateness. But what's interesting here is we're seeing the connections, right? We're seeing how it is that people are moving from one sphere to another, right? In order to create work. But one thing that's unique about comics, and it comes back to what you said about what we started talking about but didn't, which is W. Du Bois's double consciousness, is double consciousness is the shorthand is it's seeing oneself through the eyes of the other.
Yeah.
And in particular, the part that a lot of people forget about is it's seeing oneself through the eyes of the other who views you with contempt, right?
Right.
So it is a statement about image making. What's interesting about comics, if we go back to that configuration where you've got a definition of whiteness, let's talk waspness, right? Comics are for WASP, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. If you're an Eastern or Western European Jew, you're kind of not a part of that. If you're an Irish Catholic, you're not a part of it either. So we got to come back to that configuration. And what's interesting is that if you really start to think about it, what's happening in comics is we are in the beginnings of comics with Superman, we are literally seeing double consciousness turned on its head. So you've got Superman created by two Jewish kids from Cleveland, right? This is at a time when two Jewish kids from Cleveland are not considered to be white. They're not being invited to that party, right? And Superman, in many ways, is very much a Jewish kid's idealization of whiteness, right? This is what it would be like to be in the party, to integrate, to be a part of that group. Being a journalist, right? I mean, at the time, the journalist is actually very much a working man's profession. If you go back to World War II, the people who are winning, the people who are like Pulitzer praiseworthy writers, they don't have college degrees. You get in there and you work your way up. So you have a medium that is creating stories of adventure, creating power fantasies for WASPs, being created by non-WASPs. And then you layer onto that the introduction of Black people who are even further outside of that group, right? But that's the part of comics that we don't want to talk about, is the extent to which this is one of the few mediums where you really do have, where you really start to see whiteness as a multicultural construction, even though they don't have the language to describe it back then, right? Because you've got Black people, you've got Jewish people, you've got Catholic people, you've got Eastern Europeans creating the image of the WASP. That is what attracted me in part to even do my research. As I started, as an anthropologist, I had to start looking at history. I'm like, wow, all of our ideas about identity construction are here in comics in a way, and accessible in a way that is not accessible in many other media forms and many other cultural practices. And I'm sorry if I'm doing like the anthro geek thing here.
Yeah, that's okay.
No,
I'm gonna jump in right there, but we're gonna come back to you because I do want you to talk a little bit more about your research and how you connected with Ken. But I want to jump to Ken now. And
Yes.
Ken, look, the beginning of the American comic book industry, I mean, is generally pinpointed, with Superman, Action Comics #1. These artists come out of that period. Can you describe, and maybe Craig, you can help him out here. What was the industry like in the 1940s? Can you describe these? We talked a little bit about comic shops, these studios. What was the workplace like that these artists were attempting to get into and finally did?
Well, okay. The comic book industry of the 1930s and 40s, particularly in the 1930s, when it was just the American comic book industry was just forming, was at the lowest rung of publishing. And most of the guys who got into it they had other businesses going on. They were either printers or they were distributors or something else. And comic books were a sideline. It was just another way of making a quick buck. Guys like Harry Donenfeld and stuff like that. And they were not considered in the best light to work in comic books. It was cheap stuff. It was stuff meant for kids. It was disposable, and the pay in the workplace, just showed the pay was bad. The workplace was bad. I mean, there was nothing glamorous at all about comic books at the time. It's not this fairy tale vision that, you know, fans have nowadays. Oh, I want to become a comic book artist and I'll become famous and stuff like that. Most of the people, like Stanford was saying, were on the fringes of society in a lot of ways. They were the Jewish kid from the streets, like, you know, a Jack Kirby or something like that, or you know, they were not the top-notch artists that were getting the jobs. Because if you were a really good artist, you'd be doing something else anyway. You'd be working in commercial art or something like that. So they weren't getting
the slick magazines like Saturday Evening Post. That was
exactly
the aspiration.
Exactly. You know, and you know, the guys who were getting into comic books were basically just doing it because they needed a job. And particularly with these Black artists, what was interesting about them is they were entering the comic book industry as far more accomplished than their white peers, which was really interesting to me, because every single one of these Black artists that I profile in the book had training either in high school, you know, these specialized high schools like they had in New York,
Yeah.
or they went to college, or they already had an established career prior to coming into comic books, at least the first flush, the first group of them coming in. The guys like Stoner and Pius and Elton Fax and Jay Jackson, all these guys had previous experience coming into comic books. Many of the comic book artists who first entered comics in the 30s and 40s were coming in right off the street. And, you know, it didn't have the same cachet that, you know, working in any other part of the commercial art industry did.
And then, of
Craig,
course,
if you want to jump in here, go ahead.
the book documents how many of them, you know, were trained as fine artists. And this was, I think we touched on this a little bit. They, you know, they didn't necessarily always have a high opinion of what of the ultimate value of the work that they were creating, but it was a paycheck.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You know, guys like Middleton, even, you know, he makes a point of saying he never even read the comics that he drew. He would draw them and, you know, he just turned the stuff in. It didn't matter. It was, you know, $2 or $3 a page. How many can you give me?
And on that note, you know what, let's start talking about some of these artists. You've got a book full of them. So where should we talk? I'd love to hear you talk more about the artists and their work and their, you know, a little bit of their life's journey.
Well,
I'd like Ken to start with Barreau, because I think he's one of the most interesting, because we're talking about that much of this is centered around World War II era, but he actually started in comics before Superman.
Sure.
And has a fascinating story. Go take it away, Ken.
Was that Adolphus Barreau Griffin?
Yes, that was his original name, but he changed it. Well, actually, he didn't change it. His aunt changed it. He was from Charleston, South Carolina, and he was what they called at the time a mulatto, which, you know, that was even a thing that was used on the U.S. Census up until the 1930s. It was a legal description for a person who was partially Black. Well, anyways, Barreau was from Charleston, South Carolina, and he was raised by his aunt. And he was fair-skinned. And when him and his aunt moved to New York City, they changed their last name to Barreau, and they somehow changed their identity from being Black to all of a sudden they became white. And what he did, he passed as white. And he totally changed everything about himself. He changed not only his name, but he told people he's from Poughkeepsie, New York. He just changed everything about himself. He gave himself an entirely different biography. Because of that, he
went to Yale, yes?
What's that?
He went to Yale?
He did. I was just going to say that. He got into Yale at a time where they were not allowing Blacks into Yale. If he told them they was Black, he wouldn't have got in, but he went to Yale. And, you know, it provided all these opportunities to him they wouldn't have had if he identified himself as being Black. And so he established for himself a pretty successful career as an illustrator throughout the 1920s. He got hooked up with Harry Donenfeld in 1934 when he owned the Police Gazette. And afterwards, he became he set up his own studio. He probably created the first comic shop that we were talking about. It's called Majestic Studios. And in the beginning, they were doing stuff almost exclusively for Donenfeld's pulp magazines and his girly magazines.
Hmm.
But once Donenfeld got into comics, he started producing comic book work too. And as a matter of fact, he produced some comic book work that appeared in New Fun Comics #1, which was Malcolm Wheeler Nicholson's first comic book, and considered what the first comic book to have original material in it. So he was literally in comic books from the get-go, but he never worked in the black media. He never identified himself as being black, and that was his way of getting by.
Well, can you tell us anything about his comics?
What's that?
Can you tell us anything about any of his comics?
Oh yeah, he was, like I said, he worked on quite a few comics for the through Donenfeld. For Donenfeld's pulps, he created a character called Sally the Sleuth. If we that should be one of the things, if we could bring that up on screen, possibly, Lindsay, of Bro.
Yeah,
Well, anyways,
we have some images. Yeah,
yes.
great. Yeah, great.
Thank you. It should be the first one right there, all the way on the right-hand side there. Sally the Sleuth was one of the creations he created for Donenfeld's, one of his spicy magazines. And basically she was a female detective, and her main attribute was that somehow throughout her story, she would find herself with less and less clothes on as the story progressed, and many times she ended up with nothing on by the end of the story. But she was also a detective. Well, anyways, that's what he was doing prior to getting
rather quickly. Her stories were only like 2 pages in these.
Right. Yeah, she moved quickly.
So she was one of those fast women that they talk about, I guess. But I think she was beautifully drawn. I mean, it's most people never ever knew that Barreau was his hiding his blackness and passing as white continued for decades after his death and decades into the study of comics history. No one really knew that he was black, and and that was just recently.
Well, we also know the story of George Herriman, right? The great creative.
Exactly.
Crazy Cat.
It was the same kind of thing, except Crazy Cat didn't have any clothes on to begin with. So
well,
okay.
Yeah.
But I think I was a big fan before I even hooked up with Ken on this book. I was a big fan of Barreau. He has this beautiful, simple style that is much like Tintin or something. It's like this clear line style, and whether in our viewpoint now about the adventures he was drawing and how he portrayed this woman who, yes, was without clothes often, but she was also a strong female protagonist at the same time. But you can argue the content, but the delineation was beautiful. I've always been a big fan of his artwork. It's simple and effective and strong, and I think beautifully drawn.
Okay, let's look at another one. Who else, Ken?
Well, if we do the total flip side of him, if we could go to Owen Middleton, just right there. Owen Middleton is also from Charleston, South Carolina, but as you can see, he didn't have the opportunity that Barreau did of passing as white or something like that, and he embraced his blackness. He became one of the first black journalists in the United States, working for a white newspaper. But he also found himself in and out of trouble throughout his life. That he ended up going to federal prison, Leavenworth, and during World War I as a conscientious objector, because during that time you couldn't be a conscientious objector; it was considered a crime. He became radicalized in prison because he was a cellmate of the leader of the IWW, and when he came out, he became involved with the IWW in different union groups and that at the time. Well, he also ended up in and out of prison a few other times, and that one for passing a bad check, and another time for a robbery. But in New York at that time, they had a 3 and out situation where if you're convicted 3 times, you'd end up life in prison. So he was sentenced to life in prison in 1926 to Sing Sing. And he eventually ended up in solitary confinement with a life sentence in Sing Sing prison. But in 1930, there's a philosopher named Will Durant who's very popular at that time. He's also a historian, written many books. And he published a book called The Meaning of Life, in which he asked all these famous people all around the world, like not Adolf Hitler, Albert Einstein and Mahatma Gandhi and different people to write what they considered the meaning of life. And each one contributed a chapter to this book. Well, while he was writing the book, just before it went to print, he received a letter from a prisoner in Sing Sing prison giving his meaning of life. And this letter was written by Owen Middleton, and the letter became so famous, it was published outside of the book and was published all around the country. And Middleton himself became like a cause celebrity. All these people, all these famous people got together, and he was released from prison in the early 30s. And he went on to become a social activist and a political person, a politician and everything later in life. And he spent a few years in comic books.
And if I may jump in, as I
Sure.
recall from the book, didn't he even, maybe Stanford might want to jump in on this, he even praised the comic book industry as sort of eliminating the color line. Am I wrong? I think I thought
Well,
this, excuse me, go on.
No, I was going to say, he was kind of disdainful of the comics. He was the one who said, like, I don't even read the comics that I put out, but he wasn't ashamed of the work he was doing, at the time. And he did a lot of cartooning outside of comic books. Mm-hmm. And he even ended up working for Henry Wallace there when he ran for president in 1948. Mm-hmm. As a matter of fact, Middleton himself became a politician in 1954. He ran for the state senate in New York, and he died 2 weeks before the election, but he still got thousands of votes after he died because he was so respected by his community there in Harlem.
A change on politics, because usually it's dead people voting for living.
There you go, see?
And now the living people were voting for dead people. It's wow.
All right.
Okay, if we could flip back to Stoner real quick.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, Elmer Stoner.
Yeah, to me, Elmer Stoner is the most important of all the Black artists, because he, not only embraced his Blackness and everything, but he's the one who provided a conduit for all the ones who came afterwards. I've read several different articles and interviews with some of these Black artists where they mention is Elmer Stoner who got him a job in comic books. Stoner himself was a classically trained artist. He trained at the Julian Academy in Paris. And when he came back from Paris in 1922, he participated in the first exhibition of Negro artwork in the United States, called the Negro Exhibition of Art, which was held in Harlem there in the library. And he went on to become a very important part of the Harlem Renaissance. He associated with people like Langston Hughes and Zora Neale Hurston, who were all friends of his and stuff like that. And he was all part of that, that group. So he had the ability to work in the Black media and the white media. He did work in both. He worked on a magazine called The Messenger in the 1920s, which is probably the most important Black literary magazine of the time period. Yet at the same time, he was producing work, commercial artwork for the white media. And then, in 1939, he got his first job in comic books for the Harry Chesler shop. And from that, he would, he provided, like I said, a conduit for these other Black artists that came afterwards, like Hollingsworth and Owen Middleton and people like that to even get into comics. And afterwards, when he left newsstand comics, he went into producing commercial comic books like that one there about the Jeep, stuff like that.
And wasn't he, and I'm curious about this too, I mean, he lived in the Village, if I'm not mistaken, and
yes, he did. Yeah.
And he was profiled, I mean, much like Middleton, he was a figure on the left. Am I right?
Definitely. That middle page right there, the one that says Reverend Ben, comes from a comic book called The Challenger, which that's also, if we go to that slide there, if Lindsay can get to it. Well, he produced,
There's a cover, Lindsay, of the
Yeah.
Challenger. Go ahead, can talk about him.
Okay, I'll just talk about, I'm sorry.
Yeah, keep talking.
Yeah, okay.
There's a comic book called The Challenger. There's a cover.
Right. Well, anyways, there's this comic book called The Challenger. It was a series of comics that was put out.
There we go.
Yeah, it was a series of comics.
There you go.
Focus on Stanford for a second there. He's holding it up.
There you go.
There
Perfect.
you go.
Okay. The Challenger was a comic book put out by this progressive Lutheran magazine called the Protestant. And what it was an anti-fascist, anti-racist comic book series. And Stoner was the main artist and writer. Him and his wife Henriette, was the writer of most of the stories.
Here for it.
Right. And this is one of the cover for the first issue. Joe Kubert also ended up working on this comic too. He was young at the time. He was only a teenager, but he was one of the people who contributed to this comic. But he was definitely a figure in the left. Matter of fact, he was involved with a lot of Democratic politicians at the time.
One thing that's kind of interesting to keep in mind as when you look at these comics from this period of time is the print runs were much larger than what we're used to today.
Mhm.
And they were being sold at newsstands. So they were very ubiquitous. Like you couldn't walk down the street without seeing a whole bunch of comics. People weren't saving and collecting them. They were, a lot of them were just, they looked at them, they just tossed them aside. But, and that's where I get fascinated when I was talking earlier about how you have a multicultural group of people creating identity, but it's also about creating these images that circulate in the public. It's people aren't watching TV the way we're watching TV. Comics are a mass medium. They're not cloistered. They're not in comic book shops. They are, or comic book retailers, specific comic book retailers. They are on the street corner. You walk past them every day.
Okay, you know what? And
Exactly.
as time winds down, there's two artists that I want to hear you talk a little bit more about. One of them is Matt Baker, and the other one is Orrin C. Evans. So let's start with Matt Baker. Ken.
Okay, well, Matt Baker is considered one of the great comic artists of all time, and he's actually the person who got me into this. It was my research of him. He's just a preternatural talent. He was from Pittsburgh, when he got into comics. He had a little bit of schooling and stuff like that, but basically a self-taught artist. He's one of the few who was. He had some art school. He went to the Cooper school there in New York for a bit. But he got into comics in the mid 40s there and immediately became a star for the Jerry Iger shop. And he was one of the few blacks, him and Hollingsworth, who actually physically worked in the studio with the white artist. As a matter of fact, Baker sat next to Al Feldstein. And I interviewed Al Feldstein about this some years ago. And Feldstein would talk about how the other artists in the studio would just stand around and just watch Baker draw because they couldn't believe that, one person had so much, ability. And just a marvelous talent. And within a few years, in the later 40s and that, he was hired by Archer St. John as his art director for St. John Publications. And it's St. John there is where his talent really came to fruition, and that he became probably the premier romance comic artist of all time while he's working for St. John. And he produced work like you see on the
when I
end there.
switched to the Phantom Lady cover he did, it's quite iconic and famous.
And if I can just jump in for a second here, he's also credited being one of the early creators of the picture novel, an early form of the graphic novel,
Exactly.
a book called Rhymes with Lust. And I'd also just like to note, Matt Baker was inducted into the Will Eisner Hall of Fame. And unfortunately, I can't remember exactly the year, but I was really honored and fortunate enough to be asked to accept it accept his induction for him. So it's a treat for me to hold up the Eisner and welcome Matt into our comic book pantheon. Just a little aside, but he really, his groundbreaking really doesn't even begin to describe it. I mean, he's really attached even to the creation of the graphic novel.
Oh yeah, as I said, the man was one of the greatest talents ever to work in comic books, without a doubt. And one of his, not as well celebrated, unfortunately, contributions was Voodoo over there on the left-hand side, which he was the first Black hero feature to appear in a mainstream white comic book. Unfortunately, the comic book company didn't have Baker's back with this character, because even though Voodoo was colored black on the inside, on the covers, Voodoo was colored white. And they did that because at the time, there was white retailers, particularly in the southern states, that wouldn't even put a comic book on the stands that featured a Black character on the cover. So for, the initial run, there was no, it was two totally different characters. He was white on the cover and black on the interior.
And then even on the interior, he kind of evolved from.
Right. Yeah. After 6 issues, they started coloring him white on the interior as well.
Yeah.
And likely because of complaints that they got in different parts of the country. Unfortunately, Baker died young. He died in 1959. He was only 37 years old. He died of a heart attack. It's a real tragedy.
Yes, absolutely. Okay, now Orrin Evans.
Orrin Evans. Okay, Orrin Evans was another Black journalist, and he was a highly respected journalist. He'd worked in a lot of newspapers in different parts of the country, but he too was from Philadelphia. And Orrin Evans was working for the Philadelphia Recorder in 1947 when it finally went out of business. And he had an idea. Him and several other actually white editors from the Recorder got together and they formed All Negro Comics Publishing Company. And his idea was to put together a comic book for the Black community created by Black artists and writers. And to do so, he hired his brother George and 3 of George's classmates from the Philadelphia Art Museum School, and one other artist who already had some previous experience in the Black media named John Terrell. And together they created All Negro Comics. All Negro Comics didn't get a very wide distribution, and that's why it's such a rare comic book nowadays. But he went on, they still created the material for a second issue of All Negro. But when it came time to print it, there was no paper companies that would sell them the paper pulp for to print the comic, because they found out he was Black. And so even though the artwork exists, the comic the second issue was never published. But it was an idea that was at least 20 years ahead of his time.
Great, and
the All Negro title means was not only all Negro artists, but all Negro characters.
Yeah,
exactly.
Too, it's
like Ace Harlem there, who's basically like a Dick Tracy type character, or Lion Man, which again flips the whole idea of the the white jungle lord on its head. As you can see, if you read that splash page there, he was a college educated Black man who he was sent by the United Nations to go help out the Magic Mountain community on the Gold Coast of Africa. And in this particular story here, they fight against these white interlopers who come here to try to steal some uranium from the Magic Mountain from the Black people who owned it.
Mm-hmm.
It's a very interesting idea. And like I said, it was 20 years ahead of his time. And unfortunately, just didn't even have an opportunity, didn't even have a chance.
Well, there's actually even a question from the audience about whether Ace Harlem could be revived for today.
That's a good question. I don't know. I assume it's probably in the public domain, but I know that the Evans family, as of not that many years ago, still have the artwork for the second issue. So possibly they still hold a copyright. I wouldn't know.
But it's interesting because there are quite a few, Black independent comic creators who have been kicking around the idea of trying to work with some of the Black public domain characters. I mean, and I think that we're going to start seeing a lot. I think we're going to see a lot more of them, just start to come out. And I think, it's kind of, and it kind of follows in the same vein of this book, right? It's like, this is the stuff that wasn't saved that people didn't know about, right? So that makes it really that makes it a really interesting opportunity.
Exactly.
It-
I mean,
they
if
just
you,
need to find a good publisher.
right.
One
Well-
thing that I'm curious about, and anyone can jump in and answer this, was there a Black comics community in Harlem? Did they exchange, information about gigs? Did they, talk about their artwork? Did they try to support each other?
Well, I know that there was a group of some young Black teenagers who got together, and they're the ones who got Fawcett Comics to kill the character Steamboat. Steamboat was one of those highly racist characters that you used to find in comic books, and in all different media. And that the ridiculous racist depictions that they used to have in comics at the time. And this young group of kids, I believe they're from Harlem, they actually went to Fawcett offices and they spoke to the editors, and they got them to literally stop the character. They killed off the character and removed him just because they shamed him into what he was publishing. So I'm sure there was a small community. I just don't know how big it was.
Mm-hmm. Stanford, do you know anything more about that, or?
Well, it's weird because you just get bits and pieces. Like when I was first doing my research, I was at the Smithsonian actually, and I was at this gathering, and Tom Feelings was there, and I was talking with him, and he was like, and he found out that I was doing research on comics, and he was like, oh yeah. He's like, I ghost illustrated a couple issues of Batman. He just kind of said that, just kind of like just as an aside, like, oh yeah, I did that. And then he went back to talking about his other stuff with someone else. I tapped him on the shoulder, like, what'd you say?
Yeah.
And he did mention a little bit that that he wasn't the only one. And that's actually, and what's interesting is like when Ken and I finally met, we were talking about Feelings, and it turns out that we were, this was something that we both were made aware of by him around the same time, that it was being done, and we just couldn't see it, and there wasn't anything in the production process that would make it immediately available.
How did you two connect, by the way, for you to end up
just through the book here? Just through the book here. He wrote the introduction. Craig would probably be able to tell you better how he and Stanford got together in that. But a few weeks back, me and Stanford, we had a nice talk here on camera, and that people probably find it on YouTube and that. But Stanford's brilliant, by the way. I just love listening to him. I could just sit here and listen to him talk all day.
Oh, thank you. The pleasure is really mine.
I really do.
Well,
but
the way it kind of came together is, we felt we needed a good intro writer, and I asked a few friends like Calvin Reid, like, who would you suggest? And I don't know if it was Calvin or someone else floated Stanford's name, and it was kind of a casual circumstance, really, and he stepped up to the plate and hit a home run, just like Ken said.
he did. He did.
It's a beautiful introduction. So we're glad that Stanford became part of the team.
Yeah, if I could just say something real quick, I hope that anybody who reads this book reads his introduction, and if you can bear to do it, read my foreword, because I think it's really important. You get a much better understanding of the book itself and everything that's behind it than just the text, may show you when you read it. There's a lot more going on. You have a lot better understanding, I believe. And like I say, Stanford's intro in there to me is beautiful. It's just, he's succinct and he's right to the point, and he brings out the themes and the ideas. It took me 240 pages to do, and he did it in 2. So I hope you all read that. Did a great job.
Well, I mean, in some ways, I mean, Ken, you made it a very easy intro to write. Because one thing is that, like I said, we have a couple of common experiences that we didn't realize that we had, right?
Right.
And I know that from my perspective, I'm coming at this as an anthropologist. You're a historian. And so it's like you tend to historians focus on the details, the historical details, whereas anthropologists focus on the connections between the details, the connections between the historical facts, right? And I think that's one of the things that made working on the intro really a pleasure, because what you did was you were able to really provide a lot of these little detailed facts that like when you step back from a cultural lens, it's like it's really all there, from the multicultural construction of identity through to like thinking in terms of the permeability of the color line, even to getting at how it is we integrate workplaces at a time when segregation is just fine, right? And then we come to the civil rights movement, where integration becomes a goal, and now we can actually look back at how all these other activities prepared us for what we have today, right?
Exactly.
And it's just one of the things that's great about it's one of the things that's great about comics. It's this medium that you don't think has all that stuff in it, but it's there. It's accessible. It's in the time period that we're focusing on, it's a mass medium, but the creative teams are small enough that you could actually go to everyone and talk to them, or research each and every one of them and figure out what they did, as opposed to like doing a movie where you might have several thousand people giving credits.
Right.
So it really lays so much of our society bare.
Right. And I'm glad you said the word accessible, Stanford, because to me, that's what a lot of the whole comic book history is about, is its accessibility, because the people who created the comics were basically in many, many ways people you can identify with. They're not these, almost like high-minded, guys who are, so ethereally above everybody else that, you can't identify with a Rembrandt, or you might not be able to identify with a Shakespeare or whoever. These were identifiable people. These are people of the street. These are people who are just, average Joes, putting this stuff out a lot of times. And then, like you say, you layer on the Black experience on top of that, because they had to find their way into this world, but they had to come to it through that, permeable layer you talk about, that color line, where they had to cross over into that world, and it's just, to me, it was fascinating learning all this stuff, because I learned so much. I had to totally erase everything I knew going in about history and start thinking from a totally different perspective. And, that was, the most eye-opening thing was reading American history, trying to understand American history, from no longer the white perspective, but all of a sudden this other perspective, the Black perspective, the one that nobody ever sees. And like I say, as a white man doing that, it was just such it was a humbling experience, is probably the best way of putting it. And in many ways, I was ashamed, just reading it, because there's so much I didn't know.
And Ken, I'm going to jump in here right now,
Sure.
because I also want to. We're going to wind this up here, but I also want to make it clear that this, as we talked about earlier, this is just the beginning. I mean, you've kind of laid the groundwork. What we're looking forward to, I think, is finding out more about this period, more about other Black artists. And I also wanted to mention very quickly, in case this is a discussion out there, if people may not know much about the early Black comic book artists. I didn't really either, but the name Jackie Orms is known to a lot of people. She's not included in this book, and I think it would be useful just to address this. That's a name that's out there, and they may not understand the distinction that you're making because she's not included in this book.
Right. I'm glad you brought that up, Kelvin, because I also noticed somebody asked a question about that too.
Mm-hmm.
Jackie Orms wasn't excluded, or no woman was excluded from this book. The focus of this book is on comic book artists. Jackie Orms and so many other cartoonists, people like Ollie Harrington, Mel Tapley, Ted Shearer, were exclusively cartoonists who worked in the Black media, and they worked on comic strips. They never worked in the comic book field. The focus of this book, the history I tell here, is about the people who worked in comic books, the Black artists who worked in comic books, which was, it was a unique bubble unto itself, which was different and separate from the rest of the comic book of the comics world. So I hope people understand that. There was no exclusions being made there. It was, believe me, I'd love to find Jackie Orms or another woman who worked in comics. I'm still looking.
Well, maybe you will, because you're not done.
Book has to have a focus, and a work of art has to have a frame, and the focus was comic books. I mean,
there you go.
It's like doing a book on punk music from the United Kingdom of the 80s.
Yeah, but the audience maybe not be making as many nuances. So that's why I think it's useful for us to address it. But look, on that note, I want to thank all of the panelists, and especially I want to thank Ken Quattro, the author of Invisible Men, Trailblazing Black Artists of Comic Books, published by Yoe Books. Yo, Craig, thank you. Thank you, Stanford. Thank everybody for showing up. And as I say all the time, read more comics.
The book is available, by the way, from local comic shops who need support, and online. So don't be shy about picking up a copy, because you'll be transformed just like Ken was transformed in writing it.
That's right.
There you go.